A lonely rancher found 5 orphaned bear cubs. What he did will melt your heart. The spring air was crisp in the Montana wilderness, the kind that carried both the scent of melting snow and the promise of new life. Ethan Cole, a rancher hardened by decades of solitude, guided his horse along a familiar trail when a strange sound pierced the quiet. It wasn't the cry of cattle or the call of a bird, it was softer, desperate, almost human. He pulled on the reins, listening. There it was again, a faint whimper, followed by a chorus of tiny cries. Curious and uneasy, Ethan dismounted and followed the sound into a thicket of pines. Each step stirred unease in his chest until he broke into a clearing and froze. Before him lay the still body of a massive grizzly bear. Her fur was matted, her eyes closed, her chest unmoving. But what seized Ethan's heart were the 5 tiny cubs nestled against her side. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies trembling, and their cries sharp with hunger. For a moment, Ethan stood rooted, torn between instinct and reason. A rancher knew better than to meddle with nature, especially with wild predators. But as he watched the helpless cubs cling to the only mother they would ever know, his chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years. Loneliness, grief, and above all, compassion. He whispered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, "Well now, what in God's name am I supposed to do with you?" That single question would change everything. Ethan Cole had always been a man tied to the land. His weathered hands bore the marks of a lifetime spent wrangling cattle, repairing fences, and hauling hay under the blistering Montana sun. Yet despite his strength, there was an unmistakable weariness in his eyes, the kind that comes not from hard work, but from years of silence. 10 years had passed since he lost Margaret, his beloved wife. She had been his partner in every sense, riding beside him during cattle drives, cooking meals in their old farmhouse kitchen, and sitting with him on the porch when dusk painted the sky gold. When she died, the laughter left their home, and Ethan's world grew unbearably quiet. His children, grown and ambitious, had long since left the ranch behind. They rarely called, and when they did, their voices were hurried, distant, filled with lives Ethan could barely recognize. He didn't resent them, he wanted more for them than the backbreaking toil of ranch life. But each holiday that passed without their visit carved the loneliness a little deeper. Ethan filled his days with routine. Wake before dawn. Brew coffee strong enough to cut through the morning chill. Feed the cattle, mend the fences, stack the firewood. By evening, he'd sit on the porch, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something, or someone, to come walking down the long dirt road. Nothing ever did. In the quiet of those evenings, he sometimes spoke aloud to Margaret, as though she were still there to hear him. It was the only way to keep the emptiness from swallowing him whole. And then one spring morning, fate placed 5 orphaned cubs in his path, pulling him into a story that would shatter his solitude forever. Ethan remained in the clearing longer than he intended, staring at the tragic scene before him. The mother bear had likely fallen victim to poachers or perhaps an early spring storm, but whatever the cause, her cubs were now alone. 5 pairs of dark, pleading eyes fixed on Ethan, their tiny cries echoing in the stillness of the forest. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. These were wild animals, not pets, and a rancher knew better than to interfere with the natural order. If the cubs survived, it would be by nature's hand, not his. Yet as Ethan turned to leave, one cub tottered forward, stumbling clumsily through the snow. It let out a pitiful whine, pressing its nose against his boot. Ethan's throat tightened. In that moment, he saw more than just a starving cub, he saw himself. Lost, scared, clinging to something that was already gone. It stirred a memory of the night Margaret passed, when he had sat in the dark, feeling just as helpless as these little creatures. He knelt, hesitating, then reached out a weathered hand. The cub didn't recoil. Instead, it leaned into him, its tiny body trembling. Behind it, the others watched with cautious curiosity. "Lord help me," Ethan muttered, realizing what he was about to do. He fashioned a crude sling from his coat and one by one gathered the cubs, their soft weight pressing against him. His horse snorted nervously at the scent of bear, but Ethan soothed it with steady words. The ride home was slow, each step careful, the burden heavy not just with the cub's weight but with the knowledge that his life had just taken a sharp and irreversible turn. By the time Ethan reached the ranch, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the empty fields. He glanced down at the bundle of orphans cradled against him and whispered, "Reckon it's just you and me now." The ranch that had once felt so hollow was about to come alive in ways he could never have imagined. The first nights were the hardest. Ethan had no idea how to care for wild bear cubs, and the ranch's old barn echoed with their cries. He tried cow's milk at first, but the cubs rejected it, their tiny bellies still hungry. After some trial and error, and a long drive into town for advice from the local vet, Ethan learned to prepare a formula closer to what they needed. Slowly, the cubs grew quieter, their cries replaced by soft grunts of satisfaction as they nestled into makeshift bedding near the warmth of the wood stove. Ethan's days, once governed by routine, transformed into a whirlwind of feeding schedules, cleaning, and keeping the mischievous cubs out of trouble. They were clumsy and curious, chewing on boots, knocking over feed buckets, and tumbling into haystacks with reckless abandon. Yet each chaotic moment brought laughter back to the ranch, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in a decade. Naming them came naturally. The smallest, always clinging to Ethan's pant leg, he called Tiny. The boldest, who often wandered too far from the group, he named Scout. The troublemaker who could topple a water bucket with ease became Tank. The gentle one, with soft eyes that seemed to understand Ethan's moods, was Grace. And the last, the runt who fought harder than the others to survive, he named Lucky. With every passing week, Ethan found himself less lonely. The cubs followed him as he worked the ranch, their playful growls echoing across the fields. Neighbors began to notice the change too. They'd stop by, surprised to see the once reclusive rancher smiling again, his weathered face softened by the presence of his unusual companions. At night, when the ranch grew quiet, Ethan would sit on the porch with the cubs sprawled around his boots. He often looked up at the stars, whispering to Margaret, "You'd laugh if you could see me now, darlin'. 5 little bears and me, runnin' this place together." For the first time in years, his heart felt full. But Ethan knew deep down that raising wild creatures came with challenges, and sooner or later, the outside world would come knocking. The challenge arrived sooner than Ethan expected. One crisp morning, he awoke to frantic banging on his front door. Sheriff Tom Jenkins, an old acquaintance, stood on the porch with a grim expression. "Ethan," the sheriff began, "we've had reports. Folks seen you with bear cubs on your property. Wildlife officials are asking questions." Ethan's stomach sank. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. Raising bears wasn't just unusual, it was illegal without permits. And even with permits, there would be pressure to send the cubs to a wildlife sanctuary or zoo. "They're just babies, Tom," Ethan said, his voice firm but pleading. "They wouldn't have made it without me. You know that." "I do," the sheriff sighed, removing his hat. "But laws don't care about good intentions. Officials are on their way. You'd best prepare yourself." As the sheriff drove off, Ethan's heart pounded. He returned to the barn where the cubs played, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Tiny pawed at his boots, Scout wrestled Tank in the hay, Grace sat quietly watching him, and Lucky tumbled after the others with determined energy. How could he explain to strangers what these cubs had done for him? They weren't just wild animals. They had given him purpose, filled his home with life, and healed wounds that years of silence had deepened. The day officials arrived, Ethan stood tall, the cubs gathered around his legs like children. The men wore uniforms and carried clipboards, their eyes sharp with authority. One of them, a stern-faced biologist, spoke first. "Mr. Cole, these animals don't belong here. They need proper care in a facility." Ethan's hands curled into fists, but his voice was steady. "With all respect, sir, I've given them more than a facility ever could. They're alive because of me. And truth be told," his voice cracked slightly, "I'm alive because of them." The officials exchanged glances, torn between protocol and compassion. After a tense silence, the biologist finally said, "We'll have to evaluate this carefully. For now, the cubs stay. But Mr. Cole, this isn't over." As their truck disappeared down the dirt road, Ethan sank onto the porch steps, the cubs nuzzling close. He knew the battle wasn't won, not yet. But for the first time, he was willing to fight. Not just for the cubs, but for the family he had found again. Weeks turned into months, and the cubs grew stronger, wilder, and more independent. What once had been a ragtag group of orphans stumbling after Ethan now began to resemble the powerful creatures they were destined to become. Their paws grew heavy, their playful growls deepened, and their curious eyes turned toward the woods beyond the ranch. Ethan knew the day was coming, the day he'd have to let them go. The wildlife officials returned, but this time, their tone was softer. They saw the health and spirit in the cubs, evidence of Ethan's care. After much discussion, they agreed the best course was a gradual release into the wild, supervised by experts. Ethan would be part of the process, guiding them toward their freedom. The final morning came with a sky painted in gold. Ethan saddled his horse and led the cubs, now nearly grown bears, to the edge of the forest. One by one they paused, looking back at him as if to ask whether it was truly time. His chest ached, but he smiled through the sting of tears. "Go on now," he whispered. "The world's waitin' for you." They lumbered into the trees, disappearing into the wilderness. The ranch was quiet again, but not empty. Ethan carried with him the memory of their laughter, their chaos, their love. He realized that in saving them, they had saved him too. And the moral lingered like the Montana sunset. Sometimes family isn't the one you're born with, but the one you choose to love.